Hi everyone. Several people have asked me how I make my soft sculpture heads. So here's a quick outline. Here's a piece of calico, folded double, and then I draw around a template pattern. I have different patterns for different sizes. The only thing you really need to know about this is that the grain runs diagonally across the head, or down the head I should say. Once I've done the basic outline, I then add character features. Normally I add an additional nose and an additional chin. This is then sewn up on the sewing machine, normally at about 2.5 stitches. So the dial measurement is 2.5, and I leave a gap at the back of the head where I can cut, turn and stuff. As you can see, I'm used to doing this a lot. Oh yes, one of the things I do after sewing it is to steam iron it. It heats the stitches up and then shrinks them, so it allows the stitches to set into the fabric and actually become part of the fabric as opposed to something that's just going through it. I then cut out around the area that I have sewn. It's about 1 centimeter. I'm not sure what that is in inches. I think probably about 1/4 inch. And then I cut notches in all the way around so that the fabric will turn easily. This is a standard sort of dressmaking technique. I turn to the right, the fabric to the right side, and then I use a chopstick, one of those takeaway chopsticks, to just straighten out the seams, push the nose out and the chin out, etc., etc. The chopstick is pointed enough to get into all the detail, but not so pointed like a kebab skewer or something like that, that it will actually push through the fabric. And then I use cushion stuffing. I always do the extremities first, so the nose and the chin, and fill those and try and fill them as hard or as tightly compact as I can. So I form sort of sausages or sausage shapes around the skewer and then forcing it into the areas that I want to stuff. Once I've done that, I then just generally stuff the head. You normally find that a head will take 2 to 3 times the amount of stuffing that you think it's going to take. You want to stuff the head until it's firm to the touch. You don't want it to be so tightly stretched that the stitches are showing, but it does need to be a firm, well compacted stuffing. See what I mean? Twice as much as you originally thought it was going to take. One of the things I tend to do is once I've got stuffing inside, I then force it either down or up and then fill the remaining area. It allows the stuffing to really compact tightly into the head. Once the head is as tightly packed as I think it needs to be, and that's really just by experience and touch. I don't want it to move too much in my hands. I add cheekbones or any additional features that I want to add. So for that, I'm going to, again, the same thing, just make a small sort of sausage shape on the kebab skewer, on the chopstick. And then I run it up against the fabric. So I'm not pushing it through any of the other stuffing. I'm running it between the stuffing and the fabric edge. And that allows me to create detail on the face before we do any sculpting at all. So you can see these sausages are quite tightly packed. I don't want them to spring too much when they are in place. Oop, there goes the chopstick. They do have a tendency to snap. And then once I've got them both in place, I just sort of balance it up with my hand, moving things around. Here's a pro tip. When you're threading a needle, put the needle onto the thread, not the other way around. I'm using a nylon thread here, and I'm using black just so that you can see. Normally I would use white or cream, but this is just for visibility. I'm drawing a semicircle around the opening that I've used to create this, to stuff the head. And I'm using this as a guideline to do what's known as ladder stitch. Some of you may know it as ladder stitch, some of you may know it as invisible mending, some of you may know it as Henson stitch. It's a stitch that is used for fur, etc., etc. I find it a really useful stitch for almost everything that I do with puppets. So I'm going in on either side, following along the line at approximately 1 centimeter stitch at approximately 1 centimeter distance. And then after a couple of stitches, I just begin to pull the thread and then continue. Now, this stitch is going to keep popping back until I get to the very, very end. So I just keep sewing along the lines that I've drawn. They're really just there as a guide to help me. And then once I get to the opposite end of the 2 semicircles that I've drawn, I pull the thread and push the remaining fabric inside the head, just to create a neat finish. I say neat. The back of the head actually looks like Frankenstein's monster, but don't worry about it because nobody sees it apart from you. I then put in what's called a lock stitch. So I'm doing 2 regular stitches, and then I pop the needle halfway through the fabric and wind the remainder of the cotton around it 3 times. Hold that cotton in place, pull the needle, and that stitch will never come undone. I'm not going to cut that stitch, sorry, I'm not going to cut that cotton off because I'm going to utilize it shortly. So now using my thumb, I'm just creating guidelines. So the inside edge of the eye, the distance between the eye is usually the same size as the eye itself. So I'm using my thumb as a guide for that. From the center of the eye, I draw a line down to where the outside edge of the mouth should be. That would be a normal standard face. On this one, actually, I ended up making a much wider mouth, but that's the way it works. And then I'm drawing 2 semicircles, quite enlarged, to create the flange of the nose, either side of the nose. By turning the head upside down, I'm balancing size and shape without my brain looking at or thinking about the face. What it's actually doing is looking at the shapes that are there. And now using the thread that I've already got on the needle, I'm just going to create a starting stitch, which means a stitch through and another stitch. That just means to lock it into place. And then I'm going to go through the head all the way and come out at the inside eye mark that I've made. This takes a bit of practice, but once you've done it a couple of times, you'll find it's fairly simple to find those marks. I miss a couple of threads of the fabric, i.e. just a little gap, probably about, I don't know, 1/4 centimetre. And then I've gone down to the side of the nose. So on that semicircle, I'm now digging deep into the stuffing and coming back up through the other side of the nose onto the lines that I've marked. What I'm doing is I'm forcing the stuffing forward to make sure that it stays inside the nose. So I'm creating a series of crisscross lines that run through the head, inside the nose, that are forcing the stuffing forward. Once I think I've got what I need, I'm going to start tugging the thread, and it starts to create the shape of the nose. I'll keep going through the nose until I'm happy with the final shape of it. And then I will go back up to the inner eye marking. The next thing I'm going to do is just mark 2 nostrils. So again, marking them in advance just to make sure they're equidistant and that I know what I'm aiming for when I push the needle back through from the inner eye down to the nostril. Skip a couple of threads in the fabric and sew back up and come back out at the same place again, inner eye. Slip across through the head to the inner eye on the other side. Skip a couple of threads and back down to the opposite nostril. So what's actually happening is I'm pulling the stuffing up. So I'm doing the opposite to what gravity would do, which is pull things down. So by pulling things up, I'm creating shape and altering the texture of the finished surface. I'm now going pushing that through, needle through to the back of the head, give it a good tug, and use my thumbs to balance everything out, make sure that all the stitches are even, and then put in a lock stitch. Wrap it around 3 times and pull. I'm actually going to cut this thread off now because for the next bit I want something stronger. This thread is only 2 threads thick. I want something that's 4 threads thick. So I'm taking a longer needle. You get doll making needles and also mattress needles. Mattress needles go up to the size of about 30 centimeters, which is about 12 inches. This is a shortish needle of about 4 or 5 inches. It's called a doll making needle, and it has a very large eye. So I've threaded basically 4 layers of thread, making a good knot. And now I'm going to start at the back and come to the outside of the eye. Now what I'm doing here is I'm creating cheeks. Now we put cheekbones in by adding extra, but now I actually want to pull some of the stuffing up to really create that cheek. So I'm coming out on the outside of the eye. And I'm pushing right through the back of the head to come through in the opposite diagonal. This is now to create a little bit of an eye socket before I move on to the cheeks. So if you can hear terrible snoring in the background, it's both of my dogs. They're both lying here next to me on the sofa, snoring their heads off. So back through the opposite side of the head to create the other eye socket. Again, pulling and pushing in order to create balance, making sure they are equal. I like equal heads. Lots of people don't. People like them to be different on either side. I quite like them to be symmetrical. I find there's something quite ethereal and quite strange about that, which I like with puppets. So I've come back out through the outside mark of the eye. I'm going down now, and I'm going to come out underneath the cheekbone. Now I'm making a mark, and then on the opposite side, I'm going to make sure that it's the same distance down for the opposite side of the cheek. The other cheek, sorry. So I take a stitch, skip a couple of threads, go back up, and come out on the outside edge of the eye. As I pull that thread, I start to create a dimple, and that dimple creates a cheekbone. Then I go through to the opposite side of the head and do the same thing on the opposite side. I continue doing this in and out, in and out, in and out, until eventually I have created and pulled, because that's really what you're doing, the shape that I want. If at any point I end up with a feature that I don't like, all I have to do is cut the thread, because every now and again I've created a lock stitch, which means that I am not going to lose everything I've done, just the last couple of stitches. It's a bit like press save on your computer. One quick lock stitch. And the head is complete. I did exactly the same thing with the mouth, and I decided not to film that because it was exactly the same process. So here I've taken a wooden spoon. What I'm going to do is that because it's nylon thread, I'm using a match. Normally I would use a lighter, but I couldn't find it, to just melt the nylon threads. For eyes, I use facet beads. So I'm using a facet bead and a Dremel. I am wearing safety goggles and a mask, of course. Yeah, right. And I'm cutting the bead just on the side of the center point. So I'm using a small nail, which I've pushed down through the center of the bead. And then just off that, I'm cutting down through the bead. So I've got about sort of 3/4 of the bead. I've got a sanding block on the opposite side so that I can create a flat surface, but the bead itself still has the hole running through the center of it, so that when I'm going to stitch them on later, I will be able to thread through that. So then I'm adding some glue to the top and the bottom of the wooden spoon. This is just ordinary hot glue. And I go top and bottom just in order to be able to line the head up either centrally as I need it, in this case, or at an angle. For the character's head, you want it to be at a particular angle. Once I've got that in place, then I put glue on either side, pushed behind the head, and then press down to hold it into place. Now, this is the magic trick. This is ordinary PVA household paint. In fact, this paint was the color that was left over when I finished painting my kitchen recently. So I now give the whole head a solid coat of PVA emulsion paint. Now what happens is this soaks through the fabric. It locks all the stitches into place, and when it dries, it hardens the fabric. So I've now created a 3D head. It's attached to a neck, and I place it to dry.